Before we go any further, I need you to stop whatever else you're thinking about. Take a breath, be present, because this isn't just another speech, it's a moment. And I promise you, if you stay with me until the end, you won't walk away thinking the same way you walked in. You'll see yourself differently. You'll understand something most people live their entire lives missing. We live in a world that profits from your self-doubt. A world that thrives when you shrink yourself. But I'm not here to feed that. I'm here to interrupt it, to speak to the part of you that knows you were made for more, even if everything around you has tried to convince you otherwise. This message is not for the easily distracted. It's not for those content with playing small. This is for the one who knows deep down that they've been underestimating themselves for far too long. The one who's tired of dimming their light to keep others comfortable. The one who's ready to finally step into their worth without apology. You've waited long enough to realize who you are. You've settled long enough. And tonight, that ends. So if you're willing to hear what no one else had the courage to say to you, then stay with me. Because this could be the most important conversation you've had all year. Let's talk about value. Your value. Would you like a let's start here, because this is where everything begins. You were chosen before you were ever seen. That might sound poetic, but I need you to understand how literal that truth is. Before anyone applauded you, criticized you, accepted you, or overlooked you, your value was already written, already decided, already complete. There's a kind of dignity in that truth that most people never get the chance to feel. Because we live in a culture that tells you your worth has to be earned, that you need to prove yourself, qualify yourself, outperform the next person just to be noticed, just to be counted. But what if I told you you were already counted before the world ever opened its mouth? We've been conditioned to believe that value comes from attention, that if people don't see us, then maybe there's nothing worth seeing. But the truth is, most of the world is blind to brilliance unless it comes in the packaging they're used to. So what happens to those of us who don't look like their definition of valuable? What happens to those of us who aren't loud enough, flashy enough, agreeable enough to make everyone comfortable? We start questioning our worth. Not because we're lacking, but because we've been surrounded by people too limited to recognize what's right in front of them. And when you let that kind of blindness shape your identity, you will always live beneath what you were meant for. But here's what I've learned. Silence does not mean absence. And just because your greatness hasn't been validated by the world doesn't mean it's not real. In fact, the most powerful things are formed in quiet places. Purpose develops in silence. Identity is shaped in the hidden seasons. And value, true unshakable value, doesn't need applause to exist. It simply is. You are not behind, you are not late, you are not less than. You are becoming. And becoming requires space. It requires darkness sometimes. The womb is dark, the seed is buried, the diamond is hidden deep beneath the earth. But we don't question their value because we know what they hold. So why do we doubt ourselves just because our greatness isn't visible yet? The people who try to make you feel small, the ones who overlook you, minimize your voice, use your gifts without honoring them, they don't get to define you. Just because they don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Just because they weren't there when you were chosen doesn't mean the choosing didn't happen. Some of the most extraordinary people I know carry their worth quietly. They don't advertise it. They don't need to. Because when you know what you're carrying, you don't panic when others don't respond. You don't perform for approval. You don't beg for validation. You just keep building. You keep becoming. That's what I want for you. To be so rooted in your identity that applause doesn't move you and criticism doesn't break you. To understand that your value is not determined by who chooses you, but by the fact that you were already chosen. That kind of confidence doesn't make you arrogant. It makes you grounded. It makes you wise about where you place your energy. It makes you careful about who you give access to. And when you carry yourself with that kind of quiet certainty, everything changes. You stop trying to compete with people who don't even know what they're running toward. You stop chasing titles and start embodying truth. You stop begging to be invited and start realizing you were never meant to sit at their table. You were meant to build your own. So if you've been waiting for someone to recognize you, to validate you, to finally say you're enough, let this be the moment you stop waiting. You were already chosen, already worthy. already valuable. And you don't need another person's permission to start walking in that truth. It's easy to believe you've lost your value when life has broken you in places you never expected. When people walk away without warning. When trust is shattered. When your plans fall apart. When your own reflection looks back at you and feels unfamiliar. And in those moments, there's a voice, quiet but persistent, that tries to convince you that you are somehow less. That because you've been wounded, you're now weaker. That because you've been hurt, you're now harder to love. But let me say this clearly. Being broken does not make you worthless. Pain doesn't erase your value. If anything, it reveals what you're really made of. We are taught to hide our cracks, to cover our disappointments, to pretend everything is always perfect. But that illusion is dangerous, because it trains us to believe that strength looks like never falling. When in reality, strength is the decision to stand again after you've been brought to your knees. It's the quiet courage of showing up with scars, with doubts, and with a heart that's been through the fire, and still choosing to believe you matter. We don't lose our value when we go through hard seasons. If anything, that's when our worth becomes undeniable. You wouldn't question the value of gold just because it had to be refined. You wouldn't toss aside a diamond just because it came out of the ground covered in dust. But how quickly we do that to ourselves. We look at our mistakes, our regrets, our setbacks, and we begin to shrink. We measure our worth through the lens of our lowest moments. But healing begins when we stop letting pain speak louder than purpose. So many people are walking around with heavy hearts, not because they aren't capable, but because they've allowed temporary wounds to shape permanent beliefs. Maybe someone made you feel like you were only valuable when you were giving. Maybe someone walked away and made you feel disposable. Maybe your failure screamed so loud that it drowned out everything you used to believe about yourself. But here's the truth. Their inability to see your value doesn't mean it disappeared. And your worst moment doesn't rewrite your original design. What you've walked through does not disqualify you. It refines you. It makes you more aware, more compassionate, more wise. There's a kind of beauty that only comes from surviving what should have destroyed you. A quiet resilience, a deeper understanding. A strength that doesn't need to shout. And that's something no one can fake and nothing can steal. Sometimes the reason life breaks us is not to crush us, but to reveal where we've been building on shallow ground. The heartbreak showed you who was never truly for you. The disappointment forced you to let go of what was never meant for your next season. The setback taught you how to stand on your own. It all had a purpose, even when it felt like chaos. And if you look closely, you'll see that you didn't just survive it. You became wiser because of it. There is something sacred about a person who's been broken, but still believes in their own value, who doesn't let bitterness take root, who doesn't need to explain their scars to be respected, who has learned to sit with the discomfort of their past without letting it define their future. That's not weakness. That's growth. That's healing. That's grace in motion. So if you've been looking at your life and wondering if the damage has made you less, if the divorce, the failure, the betrayal, the silence has somehow made you unworthy, I want to remind you, brokenness and worth are not mutually exclusive. In fact, some of the most valuable people carry stories that would break your heart if you knew them, but they're still standing. And so are you. You don't need to be perfect to be powerful. You don't need to be whole to be worthy. You don't need to have it all figured out to be enough. You just need to stop believing the lie that pain has the final word, because it doesn't. You do there's something difficult, but necessary to acknowledge when you begin to understand your own value. Not everyone around you is honoring it, and that truth can be deeply uncomfortable. Because for so long you might have believed that being needed meant being appreciated. That because people leaned on you, they must have loved you. That because they kept showing up, they were truly invested in who you are. But sometimes people benefit from your presence while quietly depleting your spirit. And if you're not paying attention, you'll confuse being useful with being valued. There are people who will celebrate your ability to give, but never pause to ask if you're okay. They'll rely on your strength, your wisdom, your stability, without once pouring any of that back into you. And over time, that imbalance becomes dangerous. Not because you gave too much, but because you weren't being seen for who you are beyond what you offer. That's not love. That's access. And access without honor is exploitation in disguise. You deserve to be surrounded by people who care about your being, not just your doing. People who see your humanity, not just your performance. But the challenge is when you're someone who carries quiet strength, when you're naturally reliable, when you give generously and love deeply, you often attract those who take without thinking, not because they're evil, but because they're comfortable. And you've made it too easy for them to benefit without responsibility. And here's where it gets personal, because many of us have stayed in spaces far too long simply because we were needed. We accepted crumbs of recognition and called it love. We explained away the silence, the indifference, the imbalance. We told ourselves, they're just going through something, or maybe I'm expecting too much. But deep down, we knew. We knew we were being tolerated, not treasured. We knew we were overextending ourselves just to feel like we mattered. It's painful to realize that not everyone who's close to you is truly for you, but it's also freeing. Because once you see it, you can stop overfunctioning. You can stop attaching your identity to roles that were never meant to define you. You can stop exhausting yourself trying to earn loyalty from people who only show up when it benefits them. And most importantly, you can start creating boundaries that protect your peace, not just their comfort. Value is not measured by how much you give to others. It's measured by how much you know you're worth, even when you're giving nothing at all. You are still valuable when you're unavailable. You are still worthy when you're resting. You are still enough when you're not performing. If someone only respects you when you're useful, they never truly respected you at all. And that truth, though difficult, can be the beginning of your healing. There will come a time when you'll need to evaluate the relationships in your life, not based on history, but based on consistency. Who sees you when you have nothing left to give? Who checks in not out of convenience, but out of care? Remains not because of what you provide, but because of who you are. That's where your energy should go. That's where your time should be invested. Because when you finally understand your value, you stop entertaining those who treat you like an option while expecting you to act like a priority. You were not put on this earth to constantly pour from an empty cup. You were not created to be everyone's emotional landing place while no one is checking on your own heart. Your purpose is too great to be drained by people who only show up when they need something. And if that means you disappoint a few people by choosing peace over performance, so be it. Protecting your value isn't selfish. It's wise. Let go of the guilt that keeps you tied to people who never deserved access to begin with. You don't owe continued loyalty to someone who only knew how to take. It's okay to love them from a distance. It's okay to outgrow what once felt familiar. It's okay to choose yourself, especially when you've spent years being the one everyone else chose for support, but never for protection. And if you've ever felt like your worth was dependent on what you could give, let me remind you, you are not here to earn love through exhaustion. You're here to stand in your full value, knowing that the right people will never require you to shrink in order to stay close. There's something powerful that happens when you finally understand your value. Not just intellectually, but emotionally, spiritually, and practically. It changes everything. No, not just how you think about yourself, but how you move, how you walk into a room, how you speak, how you set boundaries. Because once you know who you are, you stop negotiating with people who never had the authority to define you in the first place. Knowing your value shifts your posture. You're no longer desperate for validation because you're already rooted in truth. You're no longer chasing approval because you realize approval can be bought, but identity is something you own. When you understand your value, you don't shrink to make others feel more comfortable. You don't explain yourself endlessly to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. And you certainly don't lower your standards just to be accepted by a crowd that doesn't know your worth. People will always try to place you in boxes they can understand. Small categories, easy definitions. It makes them feel more in control. But the moment you realize your value, you start stepping outside of those limitations. You stop playing roles you've outgrown. You stop saying yes to things that drain you. You stop accepting energy that makes you question your worth. Because now, you're no longer reacting, you're choosing. From a place of alignment, not insecurity. You begin to walk differently when you know what you're carrying. There's a stillness in you, a clarity. You're no longer in a rush to prove yourself. You let your consistency speak. You let your presence carry weight. You stop needing permission to dream, to lead, to rest, to rise. Because now you know you were always enough. You just needed to stop seeking confirmation from people who couldn't even recognize the gold in themselves. And yes, some people will be uncomfortable with the new version of you. The version that sets boundaries. The version that doesn't overextend. The version that says, no, not this time. But that discomfort is not your responsibility. When you begin to honor your own value, you might lose people who only knew how to relate to your brokenness. People who were more comfortable with you when you were doubting yourself. And that's okay. Not everyone is meant to walk with you into wholeness. Sometimes the reason people resist your growth is because your confidence exposes their complacency. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your peace unsettles their chaos. But don't dim your light just to stay connected to people who were only comfortable when you were silent. You are not here to live beneath your calling just to be palatable. You're here to rise, gracefully, unapologetically, and fully. This doesn't mean you become arrogant. It means you become intentional. It means you stop entertaining spaces that no longer reflect who you are becoming. It means you choose quality over noise, depth over popularity, peace over pleasing. Because when you understand your value, you start prioritizing the things that sustain you, not just the things that distract you. You start walking away from situations that once kept you trapped. You stop waiting for closure and start creating space. You stop doubting your intuition and start listening to it. And slowly, you begin to build a life that mirrors your internal worth. A life filled with people who see you clearly, speak to you kindly, and walk beside you with honor. That's what happens when you understand your value. You shift from surviving to living, from performing to becoming, from doubting to standing tall. And that shift, that inner transformation, it doesn't require an announcement. It reveals itself in how you show up, grounded, aware, and deeply aligned with who you truly are. So you truly are. You don't have to scream your worth. Just live it. Walk in it. Move like someone who finally remembered the truth about themselves. Because when you do, you give others permission to rise too. And that is where real power begins.